Everybody, a good afternoon if you're East Coast time, and if you're on another time zone, good morning to all of you. So today we're going to be discussing a really important topic called incorporating participants' perspectives into clinical trial design. We're going to break down this talk into four portions. First, trying to understand a little more deeply what obstacles and facilitators are to participating in neurologic clinical trials. Number two is beginning to comprehend the science of engagement. And then I'll talk about our experience here at the Indiana Alzheimer's Disease Research Center with 80 Reach. And then finally, we're going to wrap up with a panelist and Q&A. So we really hope this will be mostly a interactive discussion, as Megan said, so that we're going to spend about half an hour at the end doing that as well. So I want to begin by understanding we know that recruitment is probably the biggest barrier to why we have underpowered clinical trials, why the trials are often not completed on time. But what are those obstacles and barriers? And this really nice systematic review came out last year in neurology. But in brief, there's a need to understand the problem of recruitment and how this is affecting participation and how we can generalize it to clinical trials population. And in this case, they focused in the systematic literature review on obstacles and facilitators for four neurodegenerative disorders. The majority of the studies were in Alzheimer's disease, but there was also some in Parkinson's disease, ALS, and Huntington's disease. And what they did is they took the studies and they did what we call qualitative thematic analysis to identify key enablers of trials participation. So once they finished doing their inclusion exclusion sort, they found about 36 studies that actually talked about barriers and facilitators to participation in clinical trial research. It was a pretty large size of respondents throughout these trials that looked at recruitment. Over 5,000 individuals included patients, caregivers, and healthcare professionals. And once they identified the themes from those uh, from those studies, they had three. Patient related, that is looking at their own health benefits and altruism. One's related to study infrastructure, that is treatment and study burden, and then looking at the importance of healthcare professional relationship. That is, do people get information readily about clinical trials participation and the importance of the patient physician relationship. Then they created, based on these qualitative thematic analysis, what they called weighted flow charts. So you can see here, that's the number of studies that looked at patient-related factors. And the best way to understand this is that the larger the flow, that is, the larger the width of this, the greater that it was found to be a barrier or facilitator. Not surprising, this is actually pretty similar to our research. The main reason from a patient's perspective why somebody would join a clinical trial is altruism. That is, they wanted to make a difference in science, they wanted to make a difference in the field. Another major one was potential benefit to health. So there were some smaller contributors as well, but once again, we really see those factors weighing into it. But another key, and you can kind of see that these are pretty large factors, but other key factors, and we're going to talk a little bit more about this during the Q&A, is that we often emphasize, why don't our participants want to join a study? But as you can see here, 187 studies looked at study-related factors, realizing the importance of study organization. So to a certain degree, this is disease specific, but it's also how is the trial set up? And then also looking at the study treatment. So how a study is organized, how is that perceived is really important. Healthcare professional factors wasn't studied quite as much, only looked at 84 studies. What was interesting is that certainly relationship matters, but information is really key. And I'll mention this again in our 80 Reach survey. Not having enough information or not having information that answers a prospective participant's needs was really important. So I want to actually take a moment to reflect what this means, because often when we try to figure out what recruitment methodologies aren't working, there tends to be a thought process that why aren't participants interested in my study? What are the challenges they're encountering? But this systematic review points to the perspective that perhaps there's a need for deeper reflection on study organization, especially, but even study treatment and healthcare professional factors that can be modifiable. Now, one could actually also think about it from the patient perspective to get them information that appeals to, say, altruism and a desire to contribute to science. But it's really something more important to begin to think about. And that's what today's theme of the conversation will be about how can we really begin to touch on the study, especially related enablers. And the every systematic review has its limitations. So really also beginning to look at groups at higher risk that haven't traditionally participated in studies, that is the understudied groups and older patients are really important. The systematic review acknowledged that needed to be captured in more detail. And perhaps some of the other structures that they was mentioned, study specific factors such as access to care and travel, probably we think matter a lot more in terms of studies organization. One of the key questions now is, with the recognition that we need to reorganize our studies to be more participant centered, there's this general idea of engagement, right? You need to engage your patients, you need to engage the community. But one of the challenges that I've run into when I talk to people, they're like, well, what is engagement? Well, I just kind of know that I have that. And this is still an evolving area of science. I thought these slides that I got from the Pecora grant has begun to really nail down, though, this quote feeling into science. And I think some of the key ideas here can begin to help us, even though this is an evolving science, on how to begin to more effectively develop recruitment strategies. So as we begin to figure out how to go beyond that qualitative work that was discussed to quantitative work, some key ideas, though, have emerged from the qualitative literature. And just to take a step back, for those of you who may not be familiar with those terms, qualitative is where we talk about, do focus group interviews, so do group interviews, individual interviews, and more analyze the data from, I guess, a content perspective, but it doesn't necessarily count, say, how many people did this, how many people did that, as opposed to a survey. Most of us are used to quantitative data, but qualitative data provides a complementary aspect as a saying, like, why did those people check that out? It goes beyond a survey. So these are some emerging themes that really have come from the qualitative literature on how to engage patients. So the first one is engagement context. And for many of you, we're going to talk about this when we talk about, like, what recruitment resources are available. That really is very dependent on the institution, the relationships that have already been built by the community, say by your mentors, and the pre-existing trust that is between the patients and the communities and the institution. That's what you sort of walk into. And then, we're not going to probably get into this as much today, but we've talked a little bit about with some of our sessions how to engage, the communities. That is, how do you plan engagement activities? For example, community advisory board or outreach events. How do you move forward in an action standpoint? And then also, again, the quality of engagement, right? So somebody has an event, how do people walk away feeling, from this? What are the implications? And then more deeply, after your study is done, the partner outcomes. So Ralph and Molly are going to talk more about this, but relationships are so important. Relationships beyond your study, relationships with people as people and not participants. And then finally, this is an area of focus for us, right? We think about our research outcomes, right? There's what we have to make sure that we're meeting, but where do our participants come from? Did our study get completed on time? And was that research done, quote, efficiently with the resources? And then there's also long-term outcomes as well, with the findings from the community and whether or not your findings will be implemented even beyond where you did the work. But I think one thing I wanted to emphasize, and this is kind of a busy slide here, but this goes back and breaks it down into a flow chart. When community comes to us, they are thinking about these green arrows, their context of where they come from, what have their previous experiences been with their healthcare professionals, their providers, their institutions, what has your interactions or your institutions' interactions been to engagement research? How did they walk away feeling like that? And are you going to help our community? But when we researchers talk to them, we're often thinking, how many people can I get into my study? Is my study going to get finished on time, or am I so many people behind? And one of the key elements that I hope will come out of today's talk is obviously what's in the red box is important to us and should stay important. But to begin that successful dialogue with your prospective participants, whether it's in clinic or a patient advocacy group, is that you need to also be aware and begin to understand and appreciate what's in the green box, because that's what's of interest to them. And in fact, it's so many other qualities. And that is one of the key ideas that will need to come out, to improve those relationships, is when participants come and tell me researchers are often thinking of themselves, but then the researcher's like, no, I'm thinking of you. Why is there that gap? And that gap is because we're thinking about what's in the red box, but they're often thinking about something quite different, what's in the green areas here, because that's what they are experiencing as opposed to what we're experiencing. And again, we can't experience what the communities are experiencing, but understanding why there's that gap is key to getting them engaged in research. So once again, I'm going to now go through these a little bit more, because even though many of you are still in your early part of your career, being aware of the environment where you work in will allow you to approach communities with awareness and humility. So these are things especially, that you should be aware of. What has your institution done to engage patients, whether they have their own patient advisory council or who's even coming to the clinic. And then looking at the capacity to do research, right? So many of us are at academic institutions that are quite ready to do research. But what about the people coming into the clinic? Where do they stand? So one may be at an academic tertiary hospital, but many of these centers also have outlying community clinics, right? So understanding that even though you're at a subspecialty service, how that capacity permeates even larger within the healthcare network can help you recognize whether there's potential capacity to mobilize throughout a healthcare network as you engage and seek to recruit people for research. So trust, and we are actually working on data that's looked at it. Trust is actually the most important factor. This is I cannot begin to tell you that where people start and where they end up with trust is really critical. It is a fluctuating factor. I think most people, one of the biggest mistakes that I have seen is people like, well, I've earned someone's trust, and they assume that they've kept it. Um, you need to, and you'll see the word trust throughout, so I'm going to emphasize that again. It's important to know where you stand with trust, but also understanding that there is a fluctuating course, and that you can be part of modifying and building those relationships to change trust. But before you assume that you can build trust, you need to see where people stand in terms of trusting you. And this is why we need our participants involved in our research, whether I've suggested to you to meet them for focus groups, get a survey and get a feel, because it gets back to the original slides that I showed, that your study organization, how much it is a facilitator versus an obstacle, is going to really matter. And having that feedback during research, during this engagement context, is critical. Finally, resources, or sorry, a few more things, resources. So again, sometimes, those factors are out of your control, but being more aware of what resources are there is going to be really critical. And finally, knowing what other people have done before is really important. I want to add, I think sometimes people don't realize what previous investigators have done, but those people have been in that community longer, have had that disease longer than you, especially early in the career, have been practicing. So making sure you understand where the baseline is before you start approaching and talking to people about research is very important. Okay. So another key idea is managing the engagement. So we will talk a little bit more about 80 Reach, how we got people involved from the very get-go, and had them be part of the research in every part of the process, from designing the study to helping us, spread the word about the study. But then after the study was over, including them in the science and spreading the word, and as being partners and true colleagues in terms of making sure they were published with us. And so I think, we're not going to be able to get into all that today, but I just wanted to point out again, engagement is not a one-time touch. It is an ongoing touch. It's an ongoing relationship. And once again, the people that you are interacting with, most of them belong to a larger group or community, whether it's families, their church, other clubs. Those are all going to potentially be relationships that you can help either build to facilitate your recruitment, or it can adversely affect. Again, these are not fixed things, these are mobile things. So keeping an eye on that, I like the word dynamic, is very, very important. Something you always have to constantly check the temperature, right? There's the climate. So knowing the climate of your research climate is important, but you also have to do sort of regular weather checks because things can change, very quickly. Okay, so I said trust again. If I didn't say it before, I'm going to emphasize it one more time. Making sure that your research builds trust, right? Many of you are still doing these small studies, right, as you seek to launch to those larger studies of hundreds, but making sure you're going to have to probably go back to them again to participate in future studies. So making sure they walk away trusting you is probably the most important thing. People who've previously participated in your research will be the biggest advocates, and who've had a trusting and great experience will be the biggest advocates for your research in the future. And so making sure, once again, that you check that temperature throughout and that you build trust is the most important thing. They may not remember your results. They may not remember, exactly what you said in the consent 4 years from now, but they will remember whether or not they walked away with that feeling of trust. And I think that's really important. And once again, the red box I had is where we are, but this is where they are. And this is what they're going to remember. Was the study centered to their needs? Were the study findings important to them? Was it relevant to them? And also, when we give out these results, we publish them in a journal, but they don't read these academic journals. They are reading their information in their daily lives. So, what are you doing to making sure that's disseminated to where they can be able to eventually long term, uptake those findings and share those with their communities. Once again, getting back to that post engagement trust, if they trust you and they trust the results, they will be your best advocates for disseminating that information. So, just a few things. I really like the way this was structured, but how do you begin to build those relationships where you are now and farther down the road as you grow your studies? So, making sure that you have involvement of representatives throughout every aspect of your study. I think a lot of you have mentioned participants, but also organizations, other researchers, and healthcare professionals who can also help leverage their relationships and spread the word. It's not too early to ever start engaging. So I know many of you are not, haven't yet, written down a protocol for like your, phase 3 trial, but that doesn't mean it's not too early to start talking to your colleagues who might be phase 3 collaborators and talking to them about how they can begin to engage. Because this takes time, this takes years. And by the time you're done with your phase 2 study, you're ready to move on to phase 3. You need to make sure there's other people ready to move with you. So dedicated funds and engagement and partner compensation. So that is a critical area in which we really are still beginning to understand, what exactly is compensation that's appropriate for different parties. That varies widely, but I think it is something that at least should be brought up. And again, I think most people will understand as you're developing your career what you can and can't compensate, but at least bringing up the conversation will let them know that you're thinking of it and that you care about them. And making sure again that you've got a team behind you. You've got your research team, but you're going to need your participant-centered team. That is patients, patient advocate organizations, your healthcare professional colleagues who may not be in the subspecialty field but are potential referral resources, and making sure that you talk to them throughout every stage of the process, that you're checking with them and building that temperature. And again, even after your study ends, you're still going to be focused on that disease you're studying. So making sure you stay in touch with them, whether you have an active registry that you're sending newsletters to, or other individuals that you're spreading the word about the work that they contributed is done. I think the most important thing I tell people is that if you don't give anyone feedback on how things went, they're going to assume it had no effect. So even if your study is highly impactful, the people who contributed to it need to know. All right, so now we're going to talk a little bit more about a case example of engagement to enrollment. I just said we had a large team. This is actually just the tip of the iceberg. This went across actually our center, and we also had support from my colleagues at the VA and the Community Advisory Board, which you're going to hear more about. But I think many of the challenges that we encountered in Alzheimer's disease biomarker research is very similar to what you have heard about. There's very few generalizable strategies. And how do we get people who are from understudied groups who are also most at risk for Alzheimer's disease engaged in research? And so the goal of the AD REACH study was to begin to characterize knowledge, views, and attitudes associated with Alzheimer's research and those at higher risk, and what drove people to become more engaged or be avoidant. This is especially important because a lot of the Alzheimer's disease research centers need biomarker characterization as we head into earlier and earlier detection, including neuroimaging, blood-based biomarkers. But then there's also a lot of concerns by the communities about participating in these procedures. So we sought to begin to understand that. And I'm not going to go into all the details, but I think what's really important to know is that at every single phase, so we had 3 phases, our community advisory board, of which we have a couple of leadership representatives here today, were involved all the way from phase 1. In fact, there was like a phase 0 when we were designing the protocol. They were involved in that. They were involved in the focus groups. They piloted the survey that you're going to see the results on. They helped us spread the word about the survey, and as well as we're part of the qualitative interviews in which we asked folks why they thought what they did on the surveys from a subset. So this was a short survey. We got people from personal referrals, electronic healthcare records. It was 20 minutes. It was online or over the phone. And we had almost 400 individuals participate, truly people who were 55 and older. We actually got a pretty good balance of men, as well as, and I think this is really important, people who are at higher risk for lower education. I think that was very important. And I think, we can talk a little bit more about the details of those findings, during our Q&A, but I want to really leave this open for Q&A. So what we actually found was that all participants were highly motivated to participate. So I want to go back to that first picture in which altruism was like really important. Altruism, and this was published before that systematic review, altruism just as important. But what really came out is that, even though, and these were people who highly trusted, us, and there may have been some selection bias, but there's still high trust. And there's awareness that, hey, this is an important disease, that there was still obstacles. And that include anxieties about the risk and a lack of information. And giving them more information was really important. That is sort of this modifiable factor. So really taking away, I think, the perception that, well, people just aren't interested. No, they're actually quite interested. But what have we done to match that interest with information and addressing their concerns? And so this is a courtesy of Dr. Eliason, my colleague who's listed over there, really beginning to think about a roadmap to increase community research participation, but really starting off by increasing that communication and transparency, and then sharing the wealth of information. The resources that we have, they know that they're part of it. And by doing that, it increases the research capacity. So again, we talked about the engagement context and that capacity, not just keeping it isolated, but getting it out there to the communities. And as we increase the capacity in the communities, making sure that communities know about the importance of IADRC and the visibility and how it could help them. And in the dialogue of the conversation, we'll go into that moment is how do we develop outreach models that met their community needs? And then recognizing that they want to do this. They actually want to be part of our research, but there's anxiety. And how do we address that anxiety in a thoughtful and compassionate, participant centered approach? And then change their perception about the anxiety so they can act on those altruistic intent. And so what we really began to think is that, this is a cycle, right? So if you go back and you think about the engagement, right, there's post engagement trust, right? But at the end, one day you're going to come back to that group and do another study. So what was post engagement trust ends up being your new baseline of your pre engagement trust, right? For your phase 3 study. And so how do you build that reciprocity of making sure that we take research data, right? And giving it something meaningful to them for health information return of results. So that way participants and study partners feel that long-term outcome, right? Because that's what they experience and feel. So this is where we are, this is where we are, but how do we connect those two together? And this work was done in collaboration with our colleagues with our CAB, as well as Dr. Edoe Alantude, really beginning to develop a framework of what needed to be done. And that is our recruitment strategies needed to be based on real world data. That is, we needed to include everybody, particularly understudied groups. And as we started to research and explain the importance of having data that included everybody, how we develop strategies. And then understanding that times are changing, right? So we can go into it at a future date, but there's a whole concept called agile implementation. So as try out these strategies, you got to adjust. We're constantly adapting these strategies. So again, people come to me and like, oh, I tried this strategy, it didn't work. Well, things have changed maybe since that strategy was tried out. And so you have to adapt it to where you are and then being innovative and trying out new ideas. So I know this all sounds like a really sort of vague concept, but what does it really mean? Here's an example. Here are some examples. So one of the examples that we developed together, and this was actually came from a conversation, if any of you have seen the Lancet article on risk factors to prevent Alzheimer's. Education is, I think, like the second most common preventable risk factor, early childhood education. And that became a topic of conversation I actually had with Molly's was during the pandemic because there was such a huge focus on kids when we went out in the community. And we began to realize the importance of actually having a book drive at these multi-generational events because people will come with their family and actually giving out children's books and eventually expanded to be other ages to begin the conversation about why are people from Alzheimer's giving out kids books and helping them to understand in a very benign way and a way that was comforting for the community that we were thinking about everybody when it came to brain health. I think the other thing that we did was that taking the NIH flyers and really working with them to sort of adjust it to information that the community could handle in terms of just keeping it flyers. We got feedback that the booklets were actually getting kind of heavy for our participants to pick up, especially our older ones. So trying to keep it simple, and then also for the younger generation, having QR codes to the full booklet, so if they wanted to access that information, they could. So again, taking informations also focused on brain health initially, very much focused, on a little bit more of general health and well-being, and not necessarily jumping to disease models until the people we're working with were ready to do that. So just a few other words, going to talk about the Community Advisory Board. In brief, they actually started their 9 going on 10 years, really trying to increase participation in research and screening with a focus on those groups at risk. Ralph Richards is here today. He's our co-founder and co-chair. And I think one thing I want to just take a moment to say is that we're really proud of them. They've won a lot of national recognition for their work. And, for the scientists and researchers, this looked good. But I think what's really critical to take away is that they always felt involved in every piece of the process, including the end part, in which we published. They published with this as first authors, shared first authors, co-authors, viewing their community input as a key scientific contribution. So I'm going to let Ralph tell you a little bit more about his experience, but he's a highly recognized Purple Heart veteran. He is advising two other studies, as well as the Clarity study, which some of you may be familiar with, looking at multi-etiology dementia, as well as a DoD grant for the Good Life. Has been a long time passionate Alzheimer's Association educator. And then Molly is also part of our founding CAB. She is a retired occupational therapist, actually served as vice chair for board of directors up in Rochester in the Alzheimer's Association, and also has been recognized along with Ralph, for her volunteer work in Indianapolis, as well as the national level awards. So I'm going to actually now hand it over to our panelists. And as Megan has said, this is meant to be a very sort of friendly and open conversation. And so if folks just, at any point want to take themselves off mute and turn on the camera, they're welcome to join this dialogue. But I think where I'd like to kind of start maybe with Ralph and Molly is, both of you really found your passion to advocate for patients and caregivers through your own personal experiences with family members affected by Alzheimer's disease. So can you share with me a little bit more about how your lived experiences helped you realize that you needed to become involved in designing research, spreading the word about research, but also making sure our research was focused on your community needs?
Okay, I'll go ahead and start. My father came home early one day, and when I was 17 years old, he came home early from work and said that he could no longer work because he couldn't remember how to do his job. And he was the primary financial resource for our home. And I was 17. I had a younger brother who was 9, and two older brothers who were either in college or in the military. But we had no idea back then what this meant to our family, but we knew that it was going to have a huge financial impact. And also, it impacted us quite emotionally, because as I talk to my brother now, he tells me some of the things that happened when I was away at college and how it impacted my mother and also him. But after I completed my education, I got the opportunity to work in long-term care, and I studied and gained insight into some of the aspects of the disease and realized through the years that I have several family members who have succumbed to different forms of Alzheimer's or dementia, and I still have cousins that are living with the disease. And Ralph and I have been able to observe friends of ours who are showing signs and symptoms and actually give them the resources and the knowledge to go and follow up and actually get tested. And when you talked a lot about education, and that's really something that's important to me, and just helping people to understand that lifestyle changes can have such a positive impact on their memory, and also designing research to the communities most in need. Ralph?
Okay, thanks, Molly. And thank you, Megan, for inviting us. We appreciate it very much. We're going to try to share a quarter of a century worth of information in 30 minutes. So if anyone finishes before we do, just raise your hand and we'll understand. Okay, but nonetheless, we have to have a passion. We have to have a mission that keeps us going in this business. And I have two really scenarios I want to share with you that really drove me to a point of commitment. First, my mother died when I was 19 years old. My dad remarried at a very, well, later in life, and his wife had developed Alzheimer's. He did everything for her. He cooked, he bathed her, he would let no one in the house to do anything for her. He tried to do it all himself. At night, he would sleep and put his arms around her, so if she would try to get out of the bed or move, he would know it. So one morning he got up and went out into his garden to see his flowers. And when he came back, he went in the room, he didn't see her. And then he went to different rooms and called out to her, didn't find her. And he noticed that the basement door was open. And he went to the basement door, and there he found her at the bottom of the stairs. She had fallen down the stairs, apparently looking for her, looking for him and fractured her skull, and she eventually passed. But the lesson learned here is this, is that we're not in this by ourselves. People try to do everything with a person with neurodegenerative diseases by themselves. You have to have a team of people working with you, or else you may precede your loved one in death. Scenario number two, we have a very good friend. We had a very good friend that was a very prominent OBGYN doctor. I was at home one afternoon, and he called me and he said, I just been to my doctor and I was diagnosed with dementia. He said, would you be my advocate? And I said, what does that look like? And he said, well, why don't I talk to you when I get to your house? 2 minutes later, he was at my house, sitting in my living room. It's amazing. He wasn't very far away, so he must have been using his GPS. Here's what I learned about that. Early detection is important. It's important to get your advanced directives together and everything in order because he was really estranged from his family. His wife was diagnosed with alcohol dementia, and he had no one really to rely on. He was one of my students in our Sunday school, adult Sunday school class, and that's how we grew very close. He eventually passed away, but I learned a lot from him through this process. So there's a lot to be learned. One, the economic impact on families. Families generate generational wealth. And we look at the U.S. healthcare budget. This could mean certain bankruptcy for the U.S. healthcare budget if we don't find a cure for this disease. So that's why you are important for what we do. I understand financial devastation begins even before a person is diagnosed with the disease. There was a article that stipulated that the final implications or the financial implications is tremendous on a caregiver and the family. Before the diagnosis was made, the family had an income of $240,000. By the time the diagnosis was made, their income was 104,000. It can literally wipe you out. Sophia.
Yeah, no, I think that's important. And I think as, we worked together and went to community events and we gave talks at various organizations. I think a lot of people who felt uncomfortable sharing with us about the stigma of neurologic disorders, including dementia, but other types of neurologic disorders such as stroke. I think you're being able to share that information, share as well what your experience was, being part of our research studies really helped destigmatize and open up the doors to conversations. And I think that that's really important that you felt that comfort level. I don't know if anyone wants to ask any questions. If not, I have a few more thoughts that perhaps that Ralph and Molly can share. But does anybody have any questions before about the community advisory board a little bit? Okay. Well, I think one thing that's really important is, people have in our center, we talk about recruitment. We talked about for over 30 years, really trying to get the understudied individuals who are at higher risk. And I think about maybe 10, 15 years ago, it was around 8%, and now it's closer to 30%. And I think it would be helpful for you to share, how the community advisory board contributed to that, especially with the pandemic. Recruitment for many research studies, including Alzheimer's and other neurologic disorders, really waned. So actually, our rebound happened post-pandemic, which was after a few years. So how did the community advisory board get us to that goal, and how did you successfully engage our community partners to come talk to our organization, come reach out to us? After the pandemic, when so much had happened to many of the underserved, understudied communities.
Okay, Molly, I'll start this time if you don't mind. We compile stories in our presentations. Stories are powerful. Stories with emotion is even more powerful. It lets the caregiver know you understand. We started collaborating with partners such as the United Way, Sequoia Urban League, the Greek organizations, the fraternities, the sororities. We started collaborating with 100 Black Men, the National Council of Negro Women, the Heart Association, the Kidney Foundation. We can't do it by ourselves. We needed more of an outreach. So we had to change our business model when the pandemic came. We had to work differently because post pandemic, there was a lot of procrastination, a lot of creative avoidance, a lot of loss of trust and fear that accumulated over the period of time with the pandemic. So, one of the things we did and we continue to do is that we had to offer the community something first. We can't go into the community and say, we would like to do a study, or we would like to do this clinical study, or whatever. We wanted to offer them something first, and that's why education is important. We offer them education so they can make an intelligent decision. Now, I just want to share with you a little about what we learned from a mature perspective, chronologically, that is. Probably you all remember of a gentleman named Mr. Pareto. He's an Italian economist. He coined the phrase the Pareto principle. And what he was saying essentially, for many outcomes, 80% of the consequences comes out of 20% of the causes. And it reminded me that I had to prioritize coming out of the pandemic. And that is where the 80-20 rule came. No matter if you're in a fraternity or sorority or church, 80% of the people will only produce 20% of the outcome. And 20% of the people will produce 80% of the outcome. Who do you work with? You work with that 20%. So we watch where we spend our time. Here's something else that we learned is that there's an idiom, shift happens, and it's so relevant today. And it's a perceived puzzler. It's really a strange phenomenon here. And it states essentially that unexpected changes and challenges or difficult situations is inevitable in life. So what we do is that you shift. When the shift is about coming part of to create a positive outcome, shift happens. I saw this happen, in the early 1980s when we had DRGs. I don't know if any of you remember the diagnostic related groups where there was an issue when there was a assault on hospitals to better control hospital costs. Everybody was in a panic. Everybody was in a whirlwind. So what we do when shift happens, you join that shift and you join it so that they have a positive outcome. We had no one-on-one interactions. We resorted to internet radio when we couldn't be face-to-face. We did Zoom presentations to locations. We video partner with Eli Lilly Company, and we were in order to stay connected. We did podcasts, we did media articles, we did everything we could to keep our face in the public during that period of time. It was important so they wouldn't forget. So Molly and I were contemplating on writing a book, and Sophia was with us on looking at that time. And we decided to go with a toolkit. Well, we went with an organization, Memory Advocates, and was financially supported by the Gates Foundation. And we placed it online. We didn't want anyone to profit from our ideas, so we put it online so people can cherry pick for whatever they want. But in this toolkit, there was a segment on tools for the caregiver, tools for the medical community, and tools for the community at large. So all these things we had to change our business model. Work today, and I think Sophia mentioned that, may not work next year. So you have to always look at your business model and see what's happening and don't repeat the failures. Sophia, Molly.
I just have a couple of quick things to add. During that time of the pandemic and immediately after the pandemic, we did also syndicated TV show with Access Health with Maria Shriver and Maria Carrillo and some others. But we did local TV also. We were on news broadcasts, but also on several TV shows. We know people that have their own TV shows. And then once the pandemic was over, then we did more health fairs and symposiums and summits and work with churches. And now we continue to have what we call a purple trunk and a red trunk, where we keep Alzheimer's associated materials with us, as well as IRDC materials in the car with us. So when people ask us about information, we can let them know. Because one of the things that we hear a lot when we do presentations, which really just strikes my heart, is when people say, I wish I had known this information when I was caring for my loved one. So, Sophia?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. We often think about like, whether we're in clinic or the health fairs, that it has to be a formal setting that that dialogue can occur. But as you pointed out, it can happen in the grocery store. It's happened, you've told me at funerals. You said you met somebody and you said, can you mail them this booklet? Can you get them that information? And I think, the key takeaway message for many of our investigators is that finding those like couple of folks who are so invested, who want to talk and listen to people. There's never a moment in which, when the two of you are out, that, you aren't spreading the word. And I think that that's really important. I also want to get back to something that you said earlier. We talked about like, quote, paying participants. And, for many of the I remember when I was a junior investigator, I didn't have much money, but as you pointed out, funding, but as you pointed out, knowledge is something people really want. And can you share with us, the importance of being able to share that knowledge, whether it's giving a talk to a patient advocacy organization, and being able to share some tips as well for researchers, need to communicate more broadly to people who've never been approached to research, may not be aware of research. Like, how do you begin that conversation to build that trust, and reduce that anxiety that we talked about?
One of the things that helps us a lot is when we do presentation, I do talk about myself being in a longitudinal study for 10 years because of my father having some form of dementia. And I just want to know where I stand on that. And so I tell them a little bit about what the process is like, that I feel comfortable, I feel safe, the staff is great. And usually at the end of the presentation, people will come up and say, well, how do I get signed up for that? And we've also talked to family members since it's so prevalent in my family. And we've got several family members that have gone into research. I do get a report every year. So far, I'm okay. I think it's my 10th year doing that. But what you want to do, you want to get to know the people and their culture and their community and let them know that you're genuinely interested in their health and how research will benefit them. And as Sophia said so many times, you got to develop trust. This process is not a one and done. You have to keep going back. You have to attend community events and activities. And Sophia comes with us when we do presentations and different things. And she's there at some of the health fairs. And you want to acknowledge the reluctance and fears. There's a lot of fears, especially in minority communities, because things that have happened in the past. You want to speak at their level, no medical jargon, and meet them where they are. And some fear that they're going to receive a bill if they get into a study. So you got to let them know about that, or that the information is going to go to their job and their employer may cut them loose and let them go, or it may impact their health insurance.
Mm-hmm.
So all these things are fears and reasons that people sometimes don't want to participate in studies. But you also have to go where people are located. We have met around kitchen tables, living rooms, front porches, garages, churches, community centers, libraries, at financial planners' offices, community groups, businesses, lunch and learn. And one time when we were meeting on the front porch, and it was kind of in the winter, but we had to meet outside, the mayor of Rochester asked us to meet with these people. And so we met on the front porch and talked to them. And we were at an outing that summer, and this woman, Ramsman, gave me a hug, and she said, "You saved my life." I wasn't even sure who she was at first. And she said because of the information that was shared, she was better able to get resource and care for her husband. And then they introduced us to their church, and we gave presentations there. So it's just kind of an ongoing connection. Ralph?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Molly. And I just want to add a finale to this. We heard today a lot of trust. And Maya Angelou said, people may not remember what you do or remember what you say, but they'll always remember how you made them feel. And
Mhm.
that's important because the question that Lou Holtz, and Lou Holtz, for you don't know, used to be the coach of Notre Dame. He asked the question, do you care about me? Do you care about me, or are you there to only to meet your ends? So it's important that we do trust. Now, fear is real too. And I use the acronym FEAR, fear, false evidence appearing real. And that's the reason why there's a great fear with the biomarkers, with, lumbar puncture, that sounds pretty invasive. MRI, oh, I've seen those big, loud equipment with MRI. So be serious about when they say about fear. The other thing is, you've probably heard WIIFM. That's an acronym, WIIFM. And that is, what's in it for me? They have to understand, we have to be able to, if it's that important to us, then they must be compensated also. So that's also something we do. I want to just say, as we end, that one of the probably recent additions that will be increasingly recognized in the social determinants of health, that is caregivers. Caregivers have now become one of the social determinants of health, that we need to take in consider. I like to thank the our neurology team of Dr. Dave and Dr. Brosh and Dr. Andy Sakin, and also our advisor, which is Dr. Sophia Wang, who kind of cleared the rocks off the road and got the weeds out so that we can get through and do what we want to do and the way we want to do it, because we know the community, but it's important for the community to know you as researchers also. Sophia.
Yeah, I think as we kind of wrap up, a lot of the younger people might be getting started, as well as senior people. Maybe we could share a little bit, if you're okay, Ralph and Molly. We have a bit of a ritual that we go through for and we did it for this presentation too. So the first thing is that, Ralph, when we first started, you called me up and you said, I need to know exactly what you're planning to say and do. And I was like, oh, okay. And so we've worked out this arrangement in which, it's important that the community knows that the community is leading. So you and Molly are always the ones taking the lead, whether it's talking about the information of the disease, talking about the research, um, and I think that's really critical. And then I always go afterwards to answer the questions. So again, both of you have been doing the education stuff, so you do answer most of the questions, but sometimes, there's a question that comes up about medications or specific biomarkers or imaging, and that's where a physician's input can be really valuable. But I think the other key thing is when we do give presentations and we do personalized presentations for the community, I always run it by you. I always send it to you, just like I did this one. And both of you know exactly what's going to happen. And then after that, we do a debriefing. And I think the best thing the two of you have done for me is you've given me very honest feedback. I think sometimes, and I say this with complete humility, we physicians think that we've had a successful engagement or recruitment, but unless somebody's from that community, you don't really know if you've landed where you thought you landed in terms of trust. And so someone being able to say, that didn't really quite go the way it should have, and being able to give me feedback is really important. And so getting those feedback moments at a microscopic level is what's ended up, I think, making that difference at the end of the day. And so
Yeah.
I think if we had to take away, I think anything, getting feedback from our prospective participants on how we're doing in terms of a recruitment strategy, every single little step has really taught me more than I ever thought possible. And it's been an amazing experience and story. And I want to thank you both so much. I'm going to let the two of you say any other thoughts on kind of what our sort of what I call our debriefing processes, our work processes.
I laugh, and I don't think my background is in electronic imaging. In other words, I went to school to become a radiology business manager, really actually specifically in MRI, the electronic imaging area. But I never worked in it because I went to work with Eastman Kodak Company as a sales rep, and I went from sales rep to vice president. But the whole thing I found out, things are changing so much in the world of technology and medicine that I have to come back often to make sure that everything that I'm saying is correct. There was a Russian that said, and then later President Reagan, trust but verify. Because if we tell someone something in the community, we better make sure that it's correct. Because if we don't, we lost credibility. Molly?
Yeah, I just want to touch on what Sophia said about feedback. Just be sure to get to know your audience, continue building trust, be patient, reassuring, and encouraging, because that fear continues. It doesn't just stop. Surveys are a way to do it, but they should be confidential, and let them know that it's going to be de-identified. You're not going to be able to tell who said what. And then participants, maybe a group where there's no researchers or anything involved, just the participants where they can talk freely and share their ideas. I think they may be more open when there's not someone looking at them. And then we talked about it earlier about the compensation piece. That comes up a lot when people talk to us, because some people, you show that they need the money for transportation, for their time, for food, for gasoline, and all that. So we don't want to forget that. Thank you for having us.
Those are all great points. And, I hope at a future point, people will also be able to ask more questions as their studies continue to grow. But I want to thank both of you for, helping our center grow and sharing this wealth at a national level. So I'm going to hand it back to Megan to wrap things up.
Thank you all very much. Thank you, Sophia, Ralph, and Molly, for your excellent presentation. And thanks to everyone for joining. We'll look forward to seeing you again for our next CTMC webinar, which will be next Friday, the 6th. And importantly, next week's webinar will be at 2 p.m. Eastern time. So it's a little change in time for next week. Thank you. And I hope you all have a great weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you.